No one heard the cable. No one saw the barge in time. Milwaukee Harbor swallowed a 300-foot ship in under an hour. She was outbound on October 14, 1954. 30 men passed the breakwater. The tug ahead was pulling a barge on a long cable. Under a closed sky, the link was invisible. The inquiry found partial fault on both sides and closed without resolution. The Prins Willem V rests at 85 feet, cargo still aboard. What does it take for a cable to sink a steel ship undetected? The Prins Willem V listed hard to starboard the instant the barge made contact with the hull amidships. The tilting deck threw equipment against the starboard bulkheads as 30 men registered the wrongness of the ship's motion. Water moved through the opening in the hull in a steady column, faster than any pump system aboard could counter. The gash in the starboard hull plating was approximately 20 feet long and 8 feet high, just aft of amidships. The flooding rate left no time for organized damage control. Lower compartments were taking water before the first order was given. The captain ordered abandon ship. The crew moved for the lifeboats on a deck already tilting toward the cold October water. 30 men evacuated in the dark, with the freighter settling hard on her starboard side and the rail coming down toward them. No one was lost over the rail. The rescue was fast, and the crew cleared the ship before the list became irreversible. The Prins Willem V sank at 1940 hours, exactly 24 minutes after the barge first struck the hull. She settled on her starboard side at 85 feet, roughly 1.5 miles from the Milwaukee breakwater light. The cargo inside the hold, general freight bound for Sarnia and then European ports, stayed exactly where it had been stowed. Cold fresh water preserved the wreck almost immediately. The hull came to rest on clay and stayed there, largely undisturbed. The Dutch flag was still registered. The Orange line still existed. The insurance claim moved forward through a separate legal channel. The Coast Guard inquiry opened within days of the sinking. Investigators collected statements from both bridge crews and examined both vessels. They reviewed the light configurations on the tug and barge, the radar logs, and the recorded positions of both vessels. The inquiry found that both captains bore partial responsibility. The Dutch officer and the tug captain each contributed to the collision. The Dutch officer had misread the combined light pattern of the tug and barge as they approached the channel exit at night. The tug captain had made a late course correction that reduced the available time for the freighter to respond safely. Neither finding explained the full sequence. The two bridge crews described the same final seconds in ways that did not match. The Dutch officers stated the barge lights were clearly insufficient for any crossing situation in those specific channel conditions at night. The tug's crew said the lights met every applicable standard and that the freighter had altered course without adequate warning. 2 professional crews, 2 radars, 2 sets of running lights, 1 towline that resolved into a danger far too late. The inquiry assigned partial fault to both parties. No criminal charges followed. No license was revoked by any maritime authority. No captain lost command as a result of the collision. The administrative finding carried no further professional consequence for any party. The Orange line continued its operations on the lakes. The Sinclair tug continued working the harbour. Milwaukee continued as before. Divers reached the Prins Willem V within weeks of the sinking. The hull was intact, and the cargo hold remained accessible. The depth of 85 feet was well within the working range of commercial salvage operations available in the 1950s. Refloating proposals circulated among engineers and underwriters. Multiple assessments declared recovery to be technically feasible from a structural standpoint. The numbers, however, kept running against the operation. The cost of salvage consistently exceeded the insured value of the lost cargo. One salvage proposal carried a handwritten note in the margin. It read, "Not viable." No name was attached to it. The Prins Willem V had not always been a functioning ship. Her keel was laid in 1942 during the German occupation. Construction stopped. The unfinished hull sat in the Dutch yard while the war moved around it, and the merchant fleet scattered. When the occupation ended, the shipyard's workforce was gone, its resources depleted, and its supply chains broken beyond quick repair. The hull waited 4 years. The ship was finally completed and entered service in January of 1949, well behind schedule. The Orange Line operated her on transatlantic and Great Lakes routes, moving general freight between European ports and the American inland sea. Milwaukee in 1954 was a working port. Grain, machinery, and manufactured goods moved through its docks on tight commercial schedules. The channel exit was the critical piece of geometry. Outbound vessels had to thread past the breakwater ends before turning for open water. Inbound and outbound traffic shared that same narrow geometry. Tugs with barges in tow shared it. The channel allowed no casual decisions. The Sinclair Chicago was a standard harbor tug, familiar on the lakes, running a routine petroleum barge run that October evening. The Sinclair No. 12 trailed behind on a towline several hundred feet long, sitting low, carrying its cargo through the channel exit. A long towline was entirely standard practice on the Great Lakes. It let the barge track smoothly through turns without fighting momentum. But a long towline created a specific visual problem after dark. The tug and barge appeared as two light clusters with black water between them. From a crossing angle at distance, that gap of dark water could read as open channel. The barge could look like a separate vessel entirely, or the barge could disappear against the dark surface, its lights merging with reflections off the channel water under a closed autumn sky. The Dutch officers had radar. Radar on a commercial vessel in 1954 was standard equipment, but not precise by any modern comparison. A radar return from a low-riding barge in a busy harbour exit at close range could easily merge with the tug's return or read as clutter. The officers also had a searchlight. Coast Guard records show it was activated in the final moments before the barge struck the hull. The inquiry never established exactly when the searchlight was switched on or what it illuminated before the barge made contact. One version of the sequence: the searchlight came on, the barge was identified, the helm was ordered over, but the gap was already too small. Another version: the searchlight and the towline were both resolved simultaneously at a range that made collision geometrically inevitable, regardless of any helm response. Both versions produce the same outcome. They differ only in where the failure first occurred: in the radar reading, in the delay, or in the initial course. The tug captain's account placed the Prins Willem V on a crossing path that gave inadequate clearance for the barge trailing behind his vessel. He said his lights were correctly positioned and clearly visible to any attentive watch officer at reasonable distance in those channel conditions. The Dutch account identified the light configuration of the tow as the primary failure. The barge was not readable as a connected unit in time. Both accounts were formally recorded. Neither was discredited by the physical evidence or the radar logs the investigators had available to them. The precise sequence of helm orders on both vessels in the 4 minutes before impact was never reconstructed. Those minutes stayed blank. The inquiry divided the fault sufficiently to close the file without assigning clear primary responsibility to either bridge or either captain. What the inquiry did not address was whether the lighting standard for tug and tow combinations in that channel was adequate for routine crossings. The dark gap between the tug's stern light and the barge's bow light had no illumination requirement under the applicable maritime regulations. A trained bridge crew with functioning radar and a searchlight could still fail to read a tow combination as connected, and the standard allowed it. 3 manila folders sat on a salvage engineer's desk in the spring of 1955, each holding an assessment of the Prins Willem V. The Prins Willem V was theoretically recoverable. The hull was intact, the depth was manageable, the cargo had commercial value. The math still failed. The Orange Line held insurance covering a total loss. A payout was faster and simpler than financing a salvage operation across the Atlantic. The liability question was still moving through American courts. Committing salvage capital while fault remained legally contested added risk the company declined. The Army Corps of Engineers assessed the wreck's location relative to active shipping lanes. Part of the hull lay too close to the navigational channel. A demolition contract was issued. Divers cut away the sections of hull that posed direct risk to vessels working the Milwaukee approach. The cutting was targeted and limited. Remove the navigational hazard. Leave the undisturbed bulk of the wreck in place on the bottom. By the early 1960s, the effective salvage window had closed. Insurance was settled. Legal proceedings wound down. The wreck became permanent. The Milwaukee diving community reached the Prins Willem V in the 1970s, nearly 2 decades after the freighter settled on the clay bottom. Divers found a ship that felt frozen at the moment of its sinking. The galley equipment was in place. The engine room was largely intact. The cargo hold still contained crates and containers that had not shifted since the freighter settled on her starboard side in the dark. Photographs from dives in the 1980s showed plating and fittings in the condition expected of a vessel that went down fast and clean. No trawl gear had dragged across the hull. No salvagers had stripped the accessible areas. Cold fresh water had done its preserving work for 30 years. The Wisconsin Shipwreck Registry formally documented the Prins Willem V, coordinates, depth, orientation, and a brief account of the 1954 sinking. The Coast Guard's AWOIS database listed the wreck with navigational data. Milwaukee approach charts carried the standard symbol marking its position. Recreational divers visited regularly through the summer dive season. The site was well known and well documented among the Great Lakes diving community. The case was also well documented in the official record. The inquiry existed. The statements existed. The partial fault finding existed. The full answer did not. The light configuration of the Sinclair No. 12 on that October evening was never settled to the satisfaction of all parties in the inquiry. The Coast Guard found the tug's lighting adequate under the applicable regulations in force for the Great Lakes in 1954. The Dutch insurers found the same configuration ambiguous for any crossing situation at night in a busy harbour exit channel with active commercial traffic. 2 readings of the same set of lights, the same channel, the same evening, both formally documented, neither fully resolved. No criminal charges emerged from the inquiry. No licence was revoked. No maritime authority removed a captain from command as a direct consequence. The administrative finding of partial fault produced no further professional consequence for any of the officers involved in the collision. The Orange Line eventually ceased operations, absorbed into the changing structure of post-war European maritime commerce over the following decades. The Sinclair Chicago kept working the lakes. The harbour kept operating. The standard for illuminating a towline between tug and barge did not change. If the light configuration of a tug and tow was genuinely ambiguous to a trained crew with radar, the regulatory standard was itself the problem. If the standard was the problem, then the inquiry's finding of partial captain fault left the underlying condition entirely untouched and unchanged. The Prins Willem V went down because a cable crossed the channel in the dark, with no required illumination marking the gap between its ends. The cable was permitted to be there that way, unmarked in the dark, crossing an active channel, because the regulations allowed it. The inquiry file closed with a page numbered 14. The carbon copy held in the Dutch Maritime Archive was numbered 15. Page 14 was missing. A salvage engineer's office on the Milwaukee waterfront held 3 competing bids in the winter of 1955, none of them funded. 3 separate salvage firms examined the Prins Willem V in the year following the sinking. Each produced a written assessment. The first firm estimated that the hull, resting intact on its starboard side, could be righted and pumped out within 6 weeks. The second firm disagreed on the timeline, but agreed on the feasibility. The third firm submitted a cost estimate that exceeded the others by 40%. The Orange Line reviewed all 3 documents. No contract was signed. The company's correspondence from that period does not explain the decision clearly. The insurance settlement moved faster than the salvage negotiation. Once the total loss payment cleared, The financial incentive to recover the vessel collapsed entirely. There was still the cargo. The manifest listed general freight, with a recovery value independent of the ship itself. That case was separately assessed. Cargo recovery in 85 feet of fresh water was a straightforward proposition by 1955 standards. Divers could reach the hold in a single working dive. The hold was accessible. The crates were intact. The cold water had preserved their contents. The recovery numbers should have been favorable. They were not. The legal dispute over cargo liability between the Orange Line and the Sinclair interests had not resolved, and ownership of recovered freight was contested. A salvage firm recovering cargo from a ship whose liability was still in litigation risked recovering goods it could not sell and could not return. The cargo stayed in the hold. The legal dispute moved at its own pace. The lake stayed cold, and the wreck stayed dark. The Army Corps of Engineers submitted its navigational hazard assessment to the relevant federal office in early 1956. The assessment identified 2 sections of hull that projected into or near the active channel approach and recommended removal within 18 months. A contract for partial demolition was issued. The work was completed in 2 phases over the following season by a Milwaukee-based salvage contractor. The sections removed were cut cleanly and disposed of. The demolition record noted the work was limited strictly to the identified hazard area. What remained after the demolition was a large, stable structure on the lake bottom, well clear of the channel, at a depth accessible to any qualified diver. The wreck had officially become a navigational datum, a fixed object on the charts, permanently listed, no longer an emergency and no longer a priority. The Orange Line notified relevant Dutch maritime authorities that the vessel was a constructive total loss and that no further recovery was planned. The notification closed the vessel's active registration. The Prins Willem V ceased to exist as a ship in service and became a wreck on a chart. The Sinclair interests filed their own legal response, contesting the allocation of fault as established in the Coast Guard inquiry's administrative finding. Maritime liability cases in American courts moved slowly. The dispute involving the Sinclair Chicago and the Prins Willem V was not exceptional in that regard. Settlement discussions proceeded in parallel with the court filings. Both parties had reasons to avoid a full trial, cost, exposure, and uncertain judicial outcome. A settlement was eventually reached. The specific terms were not made public. The case closed without a judicial finding on the primary cause. No judge ever ruled on whether the barge lights were adequate. No court assessed whether the towline lighting standard was sufficient for that channel. The Coast Guard inquiry's administrative finding of partial fault remained the only official statement on cause, uncontested, unchallenged, and final. The inquiry's language was careful. It assigned partial responsibility. It did not rank the contributions. It did not identify a primary cause. That careful language had a practical effect. Neither insurance company, neither shipping interest, and neither maritime authority had to respond to a ranked finding. Partial fault, equally distributed, required no one to change anything. No regulation was reviewed. No light standard was amended as a direct result. In the spring of 1957, a tug pulled a barge through the Milwaukee Channel exit under a closed sky. No record was made of its passage. The Milwaukee diving community in the 1970s was small and well connected. Information about good wrecks traveled through personal networks. The Prins Willem V was not a secret. Its position was on the charts. Its depth was accessible. Its condition was unknown until someone went down. The first sport divers to document the wreck brought back reports that circulated through Wisconsin dive clubs and eventually appeared in regional publications. The ship was on its starboard side as expected. The superstructure was largely intact. Visibility in the freshwater was good by Great Lakes standards. The galley was accessible through the main companionway. Inside, serving equipment remained on the surfaces where it had been placed before the sinking. Cups were on their hooks. A serving tray sat against what had been the galley wall and was now the floor. Nothing had moved in 20 years. The engine room told the same story. Gauges were still mounted on their panels. Valves were still in the positions set by the last engineer on watch. The cargo hold was the most significant find. Divers who entered it reported crates and containers stacked in the pattern of an active freight manifest. Nothing had shifted. Cold freshwater had prevented the biological decay that would have collapsed wooden crating in a saltwater environment within years. The wreck was, in the language of Great Lakes diving, an artifact site, a place where time had stopped and the objects of 1954 remained. Word spread. By the early 1980s, the Prins Willem V was a known destination for divers from Chicago, Green Bay, and the surrounding region. The Wisconsin Historical Society eventually took an interest in the site. The wreck fell under the state's protection for submerged cultural resources. Dive operators in Milwaukee added it to their charter rotation. Seasonal dive guides listed it alongside the other documented wrecks in the Milwaukee area. Photographers who visited the wreck in the 1980s produced images that appeared in dive magazines and later in Great Lakes shipwreck books. The photographs showed what the first reports had described: a ship frozen at its moment of loss, preserved in cold darkness at 85 feet. The images were striking enough that the Prins Willem V became one of the more referenced wrecks in discussions of Great Lakes freshwater preservation. The wreck attracted attention that the official inquiry had never generated. The physical site was more compelling than the administrative finding that explained it. Divers who visited regularly began to develop their own questions about the sinking. The wreck's condition invited a reconstruction of what had happened. The absence of structural damage except at the collision site was notable. Everything about the ship said it had been functioning normally until the moment of impact. The cargo hold, still loaded, made that point most directly. A ship in distress before the collision would have shown other signs. This one showed none. The implication was consistent with the inquiry's finding. The Prins Willem V had been seaworthy, properly loaded, and running normally when the barge struck. The fault, whatever its precise allocation, lay entirely in the channel crossing. The ship herself had done nothing wrong. The crew had abandoned her in good order. That reconstruction matched the Dutch account more closely than it matched the tug captain's version, which required the freighter to have changed course unexpectedly. The wreck could not speak to the helm orders. Physical evidence established pre-collision condition, but could not reconstruct the actions of either bridge in the final minutes. The 4 minutes before impact remained blank in the wreck, as they had remained blank in the inquiry. The hull held no record of decisions. A dive logbook from 1983, kept by a Milwaukee-based diver who visited the wreck 11 times that season, noted a detail no report had mentioned. He described a section of starboard hull near the collision site where plating showed a secondary deformation pattern inconsistent with a single point of impact. The logbook was not an official document. The diver was not a naval architect, but the observation had never appeared in any record from 1954. That detail, a secondary deformation pattern in a 30-year-old wreck, had no path into any formal record. There was no mechanism for it. The inquiry was closed. The courts were settled. The standard was unchanged. The logbook sat in a private collection, unread by anyone with authority. The logbook entry from 1983 described a secondary deformation in the hull plating near the main collision site on the starboard side. The diver noted it across 3 visits that season. He sketched it in the logbook margin, indentations extending aft of the primary gash by several feet. A single barge strike at a defined contact point would produce a defined damage zone. What the diver described extended beyond that zone by several feet. He raised the observation with a dive contact who had worked commercial salvage. The contact said it might indicate a glancing second contact after the initial strike. A second contact, a scraping pass as the barge rode along the hull, would not necessarily appear in either bridge crew's account of the collision. In the chaos of initial impact, a secondary scrape lasting seconds would be indistinguishable from the collision itself as perceived from either bridge. The observation was never submitted to any official body. The diver did not consider his logbook entry a finding that required formal reporting. The logbook passed into a private collection after his death in the 1990s. Its existence became known through references in local diving correspondence. What the secondary deformation meant for the sequence of events was unclear. It did not change the cause. It added a detail the inquiry had never examined. The Coast Guard inquiry in 1954 did not include an underwater inspection of the collision damage. The wreck was inaccessible to investigators at that depth. Everything the inquiry knew about the contact came from bridge crew testimony and deck-level observation by the surviving crew of the Prins Willem V. The physical record of the impact, the shape of the damage, the direction of force, any secondary contact, stayed on the bottom, unread by investigators. 30 years later, a recreational diver with a pencil and a logbook had documented something no official process had ever recorded. That was the state of the evidence. The case of the Prins Willem V resolves into 3 established facts, 1 unresolved sequence, and 1 systemic failure that outlasted the inquiry by decades. The established facts: a barge struck the freighter in the Milwaukee Channel exit on October 14, 1954, opening a fatal gash in the starboard hull. 30 men were rescued without loss of life. The ship sank in 24 minutes to a depth of 85 feet on the clay bottom of Lake Michigan. The Coast Guard inquiry found partial fault on both sides. No criminal charges followed. No license was revoked. The wreck was never raised. The unresolved sequence is the 4 minutes before impact, the helm orders on both vessels, their precise courses, and the exact moment the barge was identified. The best available explanation combines both bridge accounts into a single failure of a shared system, rather than a failure of either crew acting in isolation. The watch officer likely misread the tow combination, the towline gap presenting as open water in radar and low light. The Sinclair Chicago's captain made a course adjustment that reduced the available response time, a correct response to his own reading of the channel situation. Both misreadings were produced by the same underlying condition: a long towline in the dark with no illumination between its ends, legal under the applicable regulations. The most consistent explanation is regulatory failure. The lighting standard permitted a configuration that was genuinely ambiguous to trained crews with standard equipment. The inquiry found partial captain fault because that was the available finding within its scope. Regulatory review was outside its mandate and was never separately initiated. The consequence was continuity. The tug standard remained. The channel configuration remained. The conditions that produced the collision remained in place after the inquiry closed. The Orange Line absorbed its loss and eventually ceased operations. The Milwaukee Channel continued handling tug and barge traffic under the same lighting regulations as before. The Prins Willem V remained on the bottom, a preserved record of October 14th, visited by divers, documented in registries, explained by no single authority. The cargo remains in the hold. The galley equipment remains on its surfaces. The collision record is still on the bottom. The physical evidence sat 85 feet down, undisturbed, documented only by divers with logbooks, and no mandate to report what they found. Who kept the towline standard unchanged after a ship sank because of it?